Looks like it could be manifesting itself. Tonight I am joined by a rather large team here, comprised of Christian, of Kodomo, Strat, Wyatt, Ike, Jacob, James, and Wyatt. How are all of you doing this evening?
Good.
Quite well.
Fine.
Pretty good.
Definitely good to hear. I am very happy to hear that. We have quite a bit going on in the tropics. What are your general thoughts around the world?
Strange. With 28 forming today in the Atlantic, again, the Atlantic just continuing to pass expectations. And with 2 active systems in the West Pacific as well, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely interesting.
We're starting to see some more activity in the Western Pacific at the latitudes that we kind of were calling out, even back in August to September, saying if we're going to have substantial late season activity of any kind, it's most likely going to be these lower latitude storms that kind of cut west to east, or east to west through the Philippines into the South China Sea, or form further out east towards the Mariana Islands, and then move west, where sea surface temperatures would be most conducive because of the general lack of activity that the basin has seen. I mean, the Atlantic, of course, is just completely gone wild still. We're talking about a system that was at 10% odds of development yesterday morning, is now already a tropical depression, and is likely to become a tropical storm within the next 24 hours, probably a hurricane according to the latest forecast, so that's still more murky. And then we have what, if the global models are right, would be the first time in recorded history to have 2 active tropical cyclones in the South Atlantic at the same time happen within the next 5 days. So, I mean, this season continues to be absolutely wild for not just the North Atlantic right now, but we could be looking at something historic for the other side of the Atlantic as well.
Alright, well, with that being said, again, we have quite a bit of activity to go over here in the tropics. So let's begin here. We have a wide shot of the Western Pacific. You can see here clearly we do have Molave, which is the main threat here, Molave right there. And then we also have Saudel, which continues its movement here. The sun is rising in the Western Pacific, and we definitely have a concerning-looking situation from Molave. So to the team, what's your thoughts on Molave right now? Because right now it's looking like it could be a more serious threat to the Philippines.
I mean, it's really already starting to have its outer bands come across more portions of the central part of the country, although the landfall is expected right around the very southern areas of Luzon within the next 24 to 36 hours now. An impressive early structure for a newly formed tropical cyclone. Fortunately, it doesn't have the most time to really ramp up and become an extremely powerful storm. If it had another 3 days over open water, it'd be a bit more of a concern in terms of the maximum strength that it could attain. But a larger, more broad system, pretty much a significant rainfall threat, and definitely a wind threat for areas where the strongest winds will be with the system.
Yeah, for sure. CDPS rating of this system, last that we checked, was quite significant, a borderline stage 4-5, running with a stage 4 at this point. And, that is definitely something of concern. We can go over why exactly that is. First of all, here's the Joint Typhoon Warning Center's track as of 18 UTC. You can see they initialized the storm at just 40 miles per hour. We have it all the way up at 65, and we are predicting the possibility of a typhoon landfall. You'll be seeing Force 13's cone here shortly. But you can see the Joint Typhoon Warning Center predicting an 80-knot peak, that being equivalent to 90 miles per hour out here in the South China Sea, before the storm does move into Vietnam as a typhoon landfall. That's the expectation right now. So a significant typhoon is expected to develop in the South China Sea. So again, after this storm strikes the Philippines, the threat is not over. It's expected to re-strengthen, unlike its brethren Saudel. When it comes to the Force 13 cone, here it is. A Category 1 landfall is expected with maximum winds of 80 miles per hour being forecasted as of this cone's creation. That was a little while ago, with a typhoon expected in about 6 hours' time from now, according to our own forecaster, Ethan, which isn't completely out of the question, especially considering the latest microwave passes that we might show later on tonight. The more interesting thing is we have a Category 2 forecasted in the South China Sea right now, 100 miles per hour, up to 110 miles per hour, nearly a major typhoon. according to Ethan here. Definitely a concerning forecast, to say the least, and it's not out of the question, especially considering the conditions that we do have there in the South China Sea. So, to the team, what are our thoughts? What do we think the ceiling is for this storm's intensity?
I'm probably going to go with what Ethan's done, if I'm honest.
Yeah. In my opinion, I think that's like, I don't think it can really do too much above that. Of course, it has the possibility of, and of course, who knows with every system. But I currently agree with the models. That's probably around about what it can do.
I mean, mostly attributed to its current actual initialization being higher than 40, 45 miles an hour. It is probably closer to 60 to 65 based on appearance and trends. Although this one was made back when it was 50 miles an hour. It's continued to improve in structure. So long as its track over the Philippines doesn't disrupt its core too significantly, because if that does happen, then it could struggle much more significantly in the South China Sea. We've had that happen, but typically that happens with stronger storms crossing over the mass. It does have the ability to reach this intensity. Of course, though, as it gets the final approach to Vietnam, conditions will become more hostile for it, similar to what happened with Saudel. So there should be at least some weakening occurring before it comes on shore.
Yeah, it's definitely good news. The Philippine landfall predicted to be at 80 miles per hour by Ethan there. If we take a look here, this is the HWRF's rainfall totals, and they're showing in more mountainous regions the possibility of over 40 inches or 1,000 meters of rain.
Wow.
Millimeters of rain, not meters. Wow, that is a gap.
1,000 meters would be
that would be a lot more than 45 inches,
That doesn't
but
happen.
more than 1,000 millimeters of rain possible with the storm in more mountainous regions of the Philippines. And again, the CDPS rating, a borderline stage 4 to 5, definitely something that needs to be taken very seriously. And again, rainfall totals in Vietnam over 2 feet in localized areas are possible. So definitely a big concern there. Let's take a look at the models here. This is the GFS on Molave right now. And we'll take a look at it. It does show significant deepening. In the span of 6 hours, it deepens it from 1,000 to 994 millibars. We already think it's significantly stronger than that, but you can see a general deepening trend. Even as the storm moves through the Philippines, the GFS expects it to continue to strengthen and be all the way down to 975 millibars as it heads off the coast, with a pressure all the way down into the mid-950s as a 105 mile per hour storm heading towards Vietnam. And something that's interesting here, Strat, you did mention those more hostile conditions as the storm approached landfall. The GFS showing strengthening all the way up till landfall and just before.
Yeah, I mean, there could be some differences in the new model runs that are coming out, but from old indications at least, they're looking more towards less favorable conditions. I think one of the differences right now, at least, though, is at least compared to the HWC forecast track, the GFS is a bit more southerly on its landfall location in Vietnam, or not Vietnam, the Philippines initially, and has it take a stronger dip to the west-southwest than the HWC track does. So that could have some impacts in that regard, at least. And of course, you see the GFS showing a system pretty significant and then only weakening very slightly at its final landfall location. I'm sure other models, if we take a look through some of them, will be showing something a bit different than that, though, a bit further north with a bit more substantial weakening before landfall. So, I mean, that Category 2 peak is certainly possible when we see situations like this, especially if it dives a bit more to the south. But there is a mix of other models that are coming in with other solutions as well. I do think something really important to emphasize in general, regardless of its exact wind peak, is, we're talking about these very, very large rainfall totals, both in the Philippines and Vietnam. It's not particularly likely that the wind field becomes particularly gargantuan, and the most damaging winds, of course, are going to be likely within 50 miles of the center. So broadly speaking, especially for Vietnam, where the exact landfall location is still much more unclear, people should be preparing especially for rainfall impacts ahead of this system.
Yeah, I'd certainly agree with that. Again, over 45 inches of rain shown on the HWRF, a concerning sign. GFS showing over 30 inches of rain. Still a very significant bit of rainfall indeed. Speaking of the track consensus that we were talking about, Strat, this is the GEFS ensembles for the system, and they do take it, farther south than JTWC, but there are some farther northward members, and some of them still strengthen it right up to landfall. on the pressure chart here, which is really interesting. Some of them do keep it weaker, which is in line with those more hostile conditions, but I think it is not a good sign to see that earlier today we were talking about a weaker system, and now it looks like this may be peaking just before landfall. So hopefully that's not the case. Again, I think there is a possibility that some higher wind shear and those lower sea surface temperatures as we head towards Vietnam could certainly hurt the storm. We'll just have to see.
Yeah. It's really all up to, like, just being prepared. Like, if you're in those areas going to be affected, especially if you're in the Philippines right now, where it already looks like it's going to start making impacts very shortly. Definitely some threats there.
I will say the 96-hour point there on the GEFS is the ensemble mean showing about 981 millibars, so some weakening between days 3 and 4 is still quite consistent, despite the parent model showing a deeper storm with less weakening up until landfall. So we got to just hope that holds in particular. If you take the German model, for example, that weakens it about 16 millibars in the last day before it comes on shore. So it's going to depend a lot on his positioning. So if it's more southward oriented, it's going to have a bit of a better shot because shear is going to be a bit more hostile if it pushes a bit further north at the last second before landfall. There's going to be some variance down at the final moments.
Yeah, for sure. All right, moving on to another form of intensity guidance. This is all over the place, but we do have some late cycle intensity guidance as of about 12 hours ago, so we're right about here in intensity. And the storm is on the upper end of what guidance was predicting, almost in line with CTCX, which has it at 50 knots. We actually have it at 55, so even exceeding those expectations. But generally, if we take a look at the upper end of guidance, I mean, it does show about a mid-range Cat 2 at the very top, with the H-WRF also touching on Cat 2 earlier in the storm's life. Before weakening, gradual weakening does begin, and then landfall occurs, and obviously the intensity tanks. So again, that is consistent with what you've been saying, Strat, with those conditions deteriorating before landfall. So it does look like we do have a general weakening trend upon landfall. Upon landfall. With these storms in particular. So it's definitely good to see. All right, with that being said, do we have any final thoughts on Molave before we move on?
Just that people in Vietnam and the Philippines need to be taking caution.
Nothing except just be on the look for some significant conditions, not Vong Fong conditions, just not fun that you'd ever want to experience.
Yeah, for sure. Something that we will be taking a look at with Molave, this is a new graphic that we've just received. Signal 2 warnings are in effect in the Philippines regarding Molave right now. So that's definitely something of concern, to say the least. And it's definitely something that we're going to certainly be tracking, as those warnings could go up. But Signal 2 warnings in effect right now in the Philippines there, and you can see our map here. That's definitely something that we need to keep an eye on. And do we think if this becomes a typhoon that Signal 3s could be on the cards?
It'd be possible. Certainly possible. I think the areas that are going to still have to look out for this most right now are going to be the areas under Signal 2 warnings for wind, and then even Mindanao just for rainfall. We're showing the rainfall forecast. The mountainous terrain could ring out, potentially up to 40 inches of rainfall in isolated areas. That's going to bring very substantial risks for mudslides, flash flooding, and other general flooding threats. So people there need to be staying on guard, particularly because even though this is formed quite recently, it still could be a very substantial rainfall threat.
Absolutely. All right, let's move on now to Saudel, which is of slightly less interest probably to a lot of us, but it does still bear watching, and we can see it here accordingly. I mean, its satellite appearance is not looking great at all as it heads towards Vietnam, but it's still a tropical storm with winds at 50 miles per hour right now. And I mean, it's still going to be a rainfall threat for Vietnam. I mean, if you're in Vietnam, you still need to be taking this thing seriously, because it's going to bring some tropical storm force winds and some rainfall with it. And that's not something to take lightly.
Yeah,
What
I
was
mean, right now we're looking at generally 4 to 8 inches for a storm maximum, at least additional rainfall in parts of northern and central Vietnam. It is quite fortunate that the environmental conditions from the system that 36 hours ago to now got so hostile that it really lost almost all of its deep convection. You can see it's still waning down right now. So hopefully we see this trend continue all the way up to landfall and the rainfall forecasts continue to diminish further, but still a threat.
what was the CDPS scale for Saudel again?
Stage 2.
Yeah, it's going to have dropped off quite significantly because those rainfall totals are probably getting pushed down now that a lot of the deeper convection's been lost and the forecasts are getting dropped off.
So it's not, again, it's not something to take lightly. So
No system is.
No.
Yeah.
No, and again, still, because Vietnam's been hit by these weaker storms in the past, I mean, we're definitely going to see a flooding issue possible here.
I mean, in the past few years, we've seen a lot of systems. Usually, they're earlier in the season. In this regard, we see a lot of these kind of tropical storm-esque or even tropical depression systems at strength at landfall come in across northern or central Vietnam and dump a lot of rainfall down. So having this kind of train later in the year isn't particularly common. Typically you'll see them go in between Hainan and I think it's Hanoi up there in the very northern portion of Vietnam. You'll see something come along in that area. We had an instance, I think 2 years ago, where one came ashore in Vietnam, then went back out past Hainan, and then went back again into Vietnam. So it really goes to show that even these weaker systems can still be very substantial threats in terms of the rainfall that they can bring.
Certainly. Alright, with that being said, let's move on now to the Joint Typhoon Warning Center's forecast for this. They currently have it at about 50 knots. We think that's generous. We have it at 45 knots. They're expecting it to weaken and make a landfall probably around 40 knots, which is fairly reasonable. I'd even think there's an argument for 35 knots at landfall, a 40-mile-per-hour tropical storm. Regardless, wind is not going to be the main threat with this. It's going to be rain. So that's just definitely something that I would be keeping in mind. But those rainfall totals from the HWRF earlier today, still relatively widespread 2 to 4 inch areas are possible in Vietnam, with some isolated areas up to 8 inches being possible. It's definitely something that still needs to be kept in mind for sure. As we take a look at model solutions, they continue to weaken the storm significantly and actually completely diminish it by the time it does strike land in some cases, including the GFS here. But if we take a look at the precipitation, you can still see some significant precipitation going all the way up and down Vietnam, with those mountainous regions in particular triggering some thunderstorms from the remnants of Saudel. So that's definitely something to keep in mind there. And then you can see that floater shifting to our other storm. It's going to be of concern there, Molave. So definitely something to look at. HWRF continues to weaken this system as well, and we can actually see that there accordingly. And you can see there that going all the way up to 1,001 millibars, but still making landfall as a 40-knot tropical storm on the HWRF, which is definitely interesting to see. Earlier today, it had a weaker solution. Well, here are the GEFS ensembles for it, and you can see again weakening upon landfall and dissipation pretty shortly afterwards. And we can also see here intensity guidance pretty much dropping this off pretty quickly. There's really no hope of strengthening for this storm at all. CHP6 does strengthen it a little bit. It tries to strengthen it back to 55 knots, but that model is the supposed to be the doom and gloom model, and when the doom and gloom model shows it barely strengthening, that's when you know the storm's conditions are just flat out not gonna cut it.
Yeah, and I think just to look at the current satellite imagery again, you see a lot of that deeper convection. Not only is it sheared off the center, but it's also waning in strength too as drier air comes in as well. So even the doom and gloom model is probably going to be incorrect in this case, unless something quite unexpected occurs.
Yes, it would definitely be unexpected to say the least. Well, now that we're done with taking a look at the individual storms, let's take a look at the wide shot of the Western Pacific. This is the GFS that we're looking at right now, and with it, I mean, what we're taking a look at is, again, Saudel weakening. We have our system Molave strengthening there, And we have two areas of interest behind that, which Nathan has pointed out on multiple occasions. The first one developing just beyond the 5-day range on this current GFS run, and if we check for consistency, trends indicate that we are definitely going to have some sort of system out of this. And this is interesting. The GFS drives it southwest into the Philippines.
Yeah, that's actually a model consensus right now.
That's bizarre.
It seems bizarre, but there is going to be a pretty strong area of high pressure to the north of the Philippines, around Taiwan, that's going to prevent this from either maintaining a more flatline attitude or latitude, or trying to actually go up in latitude.
Yeah, and there's no weakness either, so like it can't move north.
No, because that while normally you see a system try to curve north or stay at the same latitude, very strong area of high pressure that by about day 5 to 5.5 will be over the Korean Peninsula, moving towards Japan. Considering the system is going to be very small at that point in time, it's going to be much more able to potentially shove it southward and maybe even potentially avoid a Luzon landfall if it's a fully developed cyclone at that point in time. Although some of that is past 5 days, we have to wait a little bit to see the system really start to get its act together a bit more before we can be completely certain.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and we have the second area behind it, which is developed in the long range, and that could be a significant typhoon as well. Don't take what this model says verbatim, especially beyond 120 hours. We're just looking for general trends at this point. But it's definitely concerning to see two potentially significant typhoons developing on the GFS, so it's definitely something to consider. And on the Euro, we continue to watch.
Euro forms both, but keeps them substantially weaker. So, I mean, we could still have, at least 2 significant rainfall threats in the next week and a half to 2 weeks. But, still variation on the exact intensities if they form right now.
Yeah. Euro shows Molave managing to rapidly intensify as it moves over the Philippines. With its gust being around 70 miles per hour at the beginning of the run and up to 125 miles per hour as it emerges off. So that's definitely of concern. And it shows a major typhoon with gusts well over 140 miles per hour heading towards Vietnam, with it exceeding 160 at one point. When it comes to those maximum gusts, which would be indicative of a major typhoon.
I will say, to be fair, though, the European has struggled consistently with storms crossing over land and re-emerging, trying to, oddly intensify them over circumstances where they'd flatline in strength or weaken out. We've seen it multiple times, try to brown ocean effect storms coming ashore in southern Texas. So I would take a grain of salt with this particular model run for the time being.
That's fair, and then we can see our second system developing here. It does also drive it to the southwest, which is bizarre to me. Again, with that's just not a normal pattern. That's not something that you see overly often.
I mean, it's mostly because the system's going to be smaller and it's more formative stage at that point. We've seen, if you put on the anomaly map for pressures on the European or GFS, it gives a good example of it. Typically, I think YouTube 2018 is a good example. You have a very strong storm, you'll have an anomalous area of high pressure come out well to the north, but since it's quite large, it won't take a massive dive to the south and west. It'll just, take a little west-southwest kink for, about a day or so, and then continue a more gradual westward motion or begin to try to gain latitude when that area of high pressure moves out of the way. But because this potential upcoming system will be much smaller and much earlier in its lifespan, it won't have nearly as much influence in the upper atmosphere, and those steering currents will be more and more likely to push it further southward than you would normally see with a more developed system.
Yeah, for sure. Alright, well, it's time to move on from this, and now we're going to move over to the Atlantic, which I know is an area that a lot of people are very interested in today. In the Atlantic, we have Tropical Depression 28. I can't believe I'm saying that, but we do have Tropical Depression 28, which has had a brand new convective burst that's occurred since the stream has begun. over the center of circulation there. So that's definitely not a good sign when it comes to the future of the system. And then we have Epsilon there moving out to sea. It's going to rapidly accelerate. That could become a significant extratropical cyclone, and it could get down to sub 930 millibars as it heads up to the north there. That's going to be really a concern, with tropical storm force winds possible for Ireland, Iceland, the United Kingdom. So all those areas need to be watching Epsilon as it does move northward. But we are going to be talking about these storms for the rest of their foreseeable tropical lifespans. If you do want updates on Epsilon as it moves towards the United Kingdom, our Force 13 UK page should have that covered. Alright, well, let's take a look at our Atlantic tropical weather outlook. This is courtesy of our team member Amy. And you can see here, again, tropical depression 28, 30 miles per hour, 1,005 millibars. And Epsilon at 80 miles per hour, 958. But you can see there, again, Epsilon at that higher latitude, and it's accelerating out to sea. And 28, we have a lot to talk about with 28. It could be a potential threat for the Gulf Coast. It could be a potential threat for the Yucatan and Cuba. So definitely something that we're going to be talking about, I would imagine, extensively here within the next couple of minutes. Well, let's talk about Tropical Depression 28. This is its current satellite appearance, and let's get a refresh on that so we can get the latest imagery. To the team, what do we think of this system right now?
It's quite... It looks like it's going to move kind of maybe between the Yucatan and Cuba, and briefly become a hurricane, I think, is what the National Hurricane Center is currently putting it as, before weakening when entering the Gulf, and then perhaps hitting somewhere in the U.S. later on this week.
Yeah, I think one of the harder things, a full commentary is that because it's still in its very early formative stages and also not moving much right now in particular, it's actually currently only moving at 2 miles an hour. Getting a really good angle on the track and then intensity as well is pretty difficult right now, and it is noted by the National Hurricane Center that both are a bit lower confidence than usual. This system right now could still either make landfall in western Cuba, move in between the Yucatan and Cuba, or come ashore in the Yucatan Peninsula in a similar geographic area to where Delta did, but fortunately very likely not at a similar intensity. Once it gets into the Gulf of Mexico, it's going to have still pretty favorable conditions for a little bit, and that's where it's currently forecast to become a hurricane before getting really picked up sharply by a trough that's going to come in and make landfall in the United States Gulf Coast as a probable tropical storm on a weakening trend at that point in time, while really accelerating rapidly. I don't know if you can pull up the National Hurricane Center's 5-day cone, but this thing goes from the central Gulf of Mexico or northern Gulf of Mexico to Tennessee in 24 hours. So it's really going to pick up sharply in movement.
Yeah, it really all depends on how fast this storm can develop, because it's currently over an area of warm waters and low shear, which is good. That's how the storm's going to be able to organize, but it really depends how organized it's going to get before it starts moving, because from what I understand, wind shear is going to start to significantly pick up once it begins entering the Gulf. So if it's a well-developed storm, it probably be affected by it, but probably not by that much. But still, its beginning stages and not very organized, then it's probably going to really suffer by that point.
We have seen numerous storms this year with a pretty similar satellite appearance and structure development, and such the structure the National Hurricane Center noted is favorable for sort of quicker intensification over the next 2 to 3 days. So that's why they are saying a hurricane right now as it enters the Gulf of Mexico. But like you also said, shear is supposed to pick up very significantly, probably southwest to northeast shear, as this trough comes in and picks it up. So you're very likely going to see some weakening before it comes on shore, and a quicker dissipation once it starts moving inland as well. Fortunately, the forward speed could mean total rainfall is limited in some areas, but the fact that shear will likely be ripping convection to the north of the center means some areas could also get enhanced rainfall compared to what you get if there's a more unified tropical cyclone moving at the same speed.
Yeah, that is true. And again, there is the possibility this storm does intensify faster than forecast. It appears, last I checked, and this may be different, but earlier today, the mid-level center and low-level center were not stacked on top of each other. I don't know exactly, I haven't taken a closer look at imagery, but considering we have a huge burst of convection here, sometimes you get a big burst when the two do align, so hopefully that's not the case, because I was told that we weren't going to have alignment of these probably for the next day or two, so if alignment has occurred, that would be far worse. If someone in chat knows that, you can feel free to put that in there as well, but definitely that convective burst is a sign of some sort of strengthening that is occurring.
Yeah, I do think it's also important to note, just right now as well, the variance of potential landfall locations. So not just for Cuba or the Yucatan Peninsula, where people need to be finishing preparations tonight and through the earlier parts of tomorrow, but even for the United States, we could see a landfall anywhere from western Louisiana, similar to where Delta and Laura made landfall, all the way into Florida, into the Florida Panhandle, where multiple models still indicate landfall. There is a significant uncertainty with how this tropics is going to come in exactly and pick it up. So there's a wide range of disagreement there and a wide spread in the computer models. So it's always important to keep that in mind. If this does make landfall in Louisiana, though, and stay a bit closer to the middle and west of center on the envelope of guidance, it'll be the 5th named storm to make landfall in Louisiana this year, and a record-breaking 11th named storm to make landfall in the continental United States in a hurricane season.
And if it does make landfall, if the forecast area is correct, which I'm not saying it will be, but if it is correct, it does make landfall near the Mississippi Delta, that will be the 3rd storm to make landfall in that region after Marco and Cristobal.
Yeah.
I mean, that'd be
Also,
quite...
wouldn't it break the record of most landfalling systems in Louisiana in a single season?
Well, shame Delta didn't make landfall in the Delta.
Yeah, I mean, it might. I think it does. I think 5 would be the record for Louisiana for a single season. And if it makes landfall in more eastern Louisiana, you kind of have a bit of a unique circumstance where both the hurricane strength systems that came on shore made landfall in almost the identical location in western Louisiana, and then have the 3 tropical storm strength systems at landfall coming on shore really around eastern Louisiana and quite similar regions as well. So in terms of impacts, it is going to vary quite significantly based on the uncertainty in the track forecast and intensity forecast. But people along the central Gulf Coast do need to monitor its developments very closely in the coming days.
Yeah, for sure. All right, we're going to be moving on here just for a little bit. Still talking about 28L. This is Force 13's cone. This is made by yours truly. This was made as of 6 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, so just 2 hours ago. Again, Force 13 is forecasting a Category 1 peak, a brief Category 1 peak, with a 60-mile-per-hour landfall in the Yucatan being a possibility, and a 60-mile-per-hour landfall currently being forecast for that Gulf Coast landfall as well. And again, the strat said there is a large amount of variance with where exactly that landfall could occur, as is shown on this cone. But regardless, we're relatively confident in a hurricane-strength system, and again, this could be a conservative forecast. We'll just have to see. When it comes to our key messages, this is courtesy of Wyatt.
Yeah.
We do have our key messages as well, which is heavy rainfall, the main threat with this system for western Cuba as well as southern Florida at this time. Tropical storm conditions are possible in the western tip of Cuba, where a tropical storm watch is in effect. Tropical storm or even hurricane conditions are possible in the northern Yucatan Peninsula, and all interest in the northern Gulf Coast from Louisiana to the Florida Panhandle should monitor the progress of this system, as there is a threat of dangerous storm surge, damaging winds, and flooding rains. This could cause issues where areas that have already had impacts from other hurricanes get impacted yet again. Again, this is made courtesy of Wyatt. It came out at the same time as our cone. Alright. Well, with that being said, let's take a look at the track guidance. Earlier today, it was absolutely chaotic. The spread was basically everywhere. Yesterday, there were some even looping it back into the Caribbean. It was pretty crazy. So to see the consensus tighten up is a good thing for forecasters. But something that is notable here is it does look like the model consensus, the general model consensus, pretty close to the NHC's forecast, but it looks like the NHC is on the western side, especially towards the longer range, the day 3, 4, and 5, of the general track consensus. So do we see this forecast track shifting eastward?
If the global models try to nudge eastward, it definitely be possible. They did talk about in their forecast discussion that they were sticking more with the global models rather than the dynamicals for this time, and that they could make adjustments in the future necessary. Fortunately, now that there's an actual closed center found by recon aircraft, it's easier for these models to actually initialize it. Yesterday, when there wasn't a closed center, of course, like you said, they were completely haywire, going all over the place. But now there's a bit more of a consensus, although very notably, if you even look at the day 4 point, you have models ranging from the far center, getting towards the western Gulf of Mexico, all the way towards well further east to the point where it would be about at the same longitude as Cancun. And that's going to have some impacts on the landfall location as well, depending on which one of these paths it really decides to take. And, very notably as well, that could be the difference between a much closer approach or landfall in the Yucatan Peninsula or a much closer approach to Cuba and a potential landfall there. So even in the very short term, there's very substantial variants that will have substantial land impact differences.
For sure.
Yeah, and this storm...
Go on.
Through this storm's life, it's been a pain to track, because 2 days ago, when this storm was crazily 10-30% chance in 2 days, 30% chance in 5 days, we were looking at a potential landfall in Cuba, having it go up through the Bahamas and then hit the eastern side of Florida. And then yesterday, even as soon as yesterday, we were looking at a landfall in western Cuba, and then it scraping the coast of Florida and making landfall in Florida Panhandle. And now even today, the forecast continued to shift in a counterclockwise direction. And now we're looking at a potential landfall in the Yucatan Peninsula just over 2 weeks after Hurricane Delta made landfall, and then hitting Louisiana again.
I think something very interesting to note, though, is that the actual energy that's developed into 28L is different than what they were originally tracking 2 days ago. So, I mean, the energy that they were initially saying, this is the 10% odds the next 2 days, 30% the next 5 days, we're expecting this to offshoot to the north, northeast, and northeast, cross over Cuba and the Bahamas, and then have a more moderate chance of development between the Bahamas and Bermuda. That still exists, and the GFS actually still develops that in 2.5 days right now, closer to Bermuda. So, I mean, the fact that there wasn't any well-defined center and the energy from that first area split off, and then you have the second area that's now actually developed, is really a unique situation that you don't see happen particularly often. So now that we've had this defined center, we have a much more clear understanding of, okay, this is more of a direct risk for the very western parts of Cuba, potentially the Yucatan, and up towards the central Gulf Coast of the United States. But we still have this interesting other energy piece that could be a mild nuisance to Bermuda in a couple days as well. And if that does develop, although it isn't particularly likely because the GFS is one of the only models that actually shows that energy getting its act together in a proper time frame, it would be yet another system making a close approach to Bermuda in that scenario.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, we can take a look at the GFS here in a little bit. Something I do want to talk about is also the intensity guidance for this storm as of 18 UTC. I would assume we're probably going to be following this upper cluster. This is what the NHC has followed for their forecast. And again, that does show if you follow basically the middle of that upper cluster, a Cat 1 before weakening does occur pretty quickly at that Gulf Coast landfall. We're also making the assumption, or at least I'm making the assumption, that these models presume that the Yucatan landfall does not occur, and these models assume that that does occur, and that significantly limits intensification as this storm heads into the Gulf. There's significant disruption of the structure, and therefore we don't get anywhere near as intensive a storm as we would if the storm were to head into the Gulf as a healthy system that hasn't been disrupted by land.
Yeah. Regardless, we are probably going to see some pretty substantial disruption to the structure in the Gulf of Mexico because of this trough. It really should pull in and strip a lot of the convection to the north and east of the center. The simulated IR isn't really the most accurate, tool to use. It's very rare that you actually see that particularly accurate, but it does depict in somewhat of a good degree the expectations that this trough, which will be, very much above average in strength for this time of year, digging in this far south, could be bringing very substantial shear, which is forecast to cause that weakening from hurricane strength before landfall. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if it holds up and the system isn't the most defined to see it below 60 miles an hour at landfall, closer to, say, 50 miles an hour, even 45 if it really struggles in that last forecast point between 2 p.m. Wednesday and the landfall point. It won't have time to weaken too much, though, and even so, the main threat for at least the United States will be rain. Interestingly, once the system really gets picked up, it could become a very substantial rainmaker for other portions of the United States. You're talking about areas, at least according to the GFS model, well up into Appalachia and coming into the northeastern portions of the United States that could be receiving well over 3 inches of rainfall from this, up all the way into southern New England, in fact, with areas in Tennessee and Kentucky potentially seeing over 6 inches of rain. So definitely something to keep in watch for inland threats, not just coastally. And then you see this system, the trough that's actually picking it up, potentially delivering snowfall to southern New England. So people there will also have to keep an eye on that for some unusual seasonal activity in regards to snow, too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that this does bring a myriad of threats. Let's take a look here real quick. I'm just going to take a look at some model solutions. The H-WRF expecting this storm to thread the needle between Cuba and the Yucatan, being a hurricane as it does so, winds of 80 miles per hour. And it does strengthen it up into a Category 2 hurricane very briefly before weakening does occur relatively quickly and we get a landfall around the Alabama-Florida border as a mid-range tropical storm, but definitely that shear strat that you've been talking about picking up. When we take a look at the HMON, we see a solution where the storm develops relatively quickly. Again, we're threading the needle between Cuba and the Yucatan, but this isn't quite as strong, at about 55 knots or 65 miles per hour, becoming a hurricane shortly after. And a Category 1 with the HMON showing a landfall right into Florida near Pensacola there. And it shows a hurricane making landfall there, so that's definitely something to see. It does show the storm being much better about retaining its structure, or at least retaining its wind speeds just before landfall. And the GFS here shows not too much in terms of development, but when it comes to general track, it does take it into Louisiana, which is probably part of the reason why that track forecast is further west than it could be. I'd honestly favor the dynamical model solutions considering how much smaller the system is and how much better they're initializing it right now. But if the National Hurricane Center wants to go with global models, they do know what they're doing certainly better than I do, so I'm sure they have a reason for it. Alright, let's move on to Epsilon here. And, what was that?
Yes, I wanted to make a one last remark about TD28. So given that the center relocation and stacking have occurred much earlier than expected, I would definitely say that there is a better chance of this storm potentially becoming stronger than anticipated.
So the centers have stacked. That is what that convective burst is signaling. We know that the mid-level and low-level center have stacked.
Correct. And does that necessarily mean that, and this might answer a couple of viewers' questions here, but does this mean that we could be seeing a potentially stronger storm, especially if it threads the needle between Cuba and the Yucatan?
Oh, for sure. Absolutely.
As a potential peak, yes, but I would still note that because the atmosphere it's going to be encountering as this trough really picks it up, it is unlikely that it would be, very significantly stronger at landfall in the United States to where we're talking about a middle-end tropical storm to say, okay, this could be a much stronger hurricane instead, just because it's going to have about, 48 to 60 hours where it can really strengthen more significantly from this point at least before shear becomes a much more inhibiting factor. We're still talking a system that right now at least is 30 miles an hour. It's definitely not out of the question. It is the consensus right now that it will reach hurricane strength. Whether or not it can get a bit above that is outside what we're currently seeing, but the 18Z runs were initialized before a closed center was confirmed, so we're going to have to wait and see a little bit if they try to nudge things up a bit. Of course, there is obviously an average of about 5 to 10 to 15 miles an hour error in about 2 to 3 days' time in intensity forecasting.
Absolutely, and you can see it's
and
also
especially
under. It's also
since this storm, since it's organizing faster, this will give it a much longer time to be able to strengthen over this area. And if it does thread the needle, then through history we've seen storms that have done that. They've passed over this place that's called loop current, which basically supplies storms with a large amount of warm water, and we have seen storms go over there in the past and rapidly intensify. That's probably not going to happen with this storm, but if it does, since it has organized faster than anticipated, if it does thread the needle, then it'll be able to take advantage of that with warmer waters and no land interaction, and most likely we'll see a stronger storm out of this. However, temperatures will drop quickly after that, and as we've been saying, shear will pick up, so it probably will not be as intense once it gets to land.
I think the thing is, in regards to that at least, is to really take advantage of that, it would have to be facing lower shear when it moves north of Cuba and the Yucatan, which fortunately it won't be. At that point, the trough's going to start to dig in and, strip convective activity away from it. But, secondly, on top of that as well, is that it would also have to move more directly north. So if it takes an HMON track, which is almost due north, then we have some odds to potentially take advantage of that very briefly before shear became much more inhibitive. But if you have something like the consensus track right now, which is further to the west, or even more models like the European that almost yank this all the way into Texas before ripping it sharply to the north and east, it fortunately won't be too likely to have much time to be encountering those conditions.
All right, with that being said, we're going to move on to Epsilon here. Epsilon is making its post-tropical, extratropical transition right now. Its baroclinic forcing is really starting to make the storm expand right now, and we can see that there as it's going to move north, and we could see it be a significant extratropical cyclone. It's actually likely to do so as it heads up towards the United Kingdom, Ireland, and Iceland. We do have a couple new people here on the stream to talk about Epsilon. That would be Ethan and Ryan Leahy. Welcome to the team tonight. What are your thoughts on Epsilon? And I guess I'll give you both a minute just to talk about your overall worldwide thoughts as well before we go into a deeper dive into Epsilon.
Well, Epsilon, looking at it on the stream here, it definitely looks like it is undergoing its extratropical transition. It's been very stubborn, I want to say, with its transition, but it looks like it's finally happening. Of course, now we also have TD28L in the Western Caribbean that is forecasted to become a hurricane in the Gulf and then make landfall probably in yet again another storm making landfall in the U.S. Gulf Coast probably towards the middle of the week. And then we also have Saudel and Molave in the Western Pacific. Molave is really intensifying right now, and it will probably be a typhoon by the time it hits the Philippines. That's going to be something that they're going to have to keep an eye on. And then we also have Saudel in the South China Sea, which, I don't know how exactly that's doing, but definitely could have been a lot worse for, Hainan Island, but it really moved further to the south. But of course, Hainan and even parts of, Southeast Asia, Vietnam could still see some impacts from that storm as well.
Yeah, for sure. Ethan, what are your thoughts on Epsilon?
Well, Epsilon right now, as you said, it looks to be undergoing post-tropical transition. It does look to be quite large, I will say. Just looking off of the satellite imagery, the storm's influence, particularly on the southern side, believe it or not, extends all the way to the south of Bermuda. So it is still quite a large storm. If you don't mind, Thomas, I'd just like to go over my worldwide thoughts, if you don't mind.
Yeah, it's fine.
Something just to note real quick about Epsilon. ATCF has just bumped it back down to 75 miles an hour. Just want to point that out. Tropical Depression 28 looks pretty unorganized. Wouldn't surprise me if it actually does not peak as a hurricane. I don't think it'll get to hurricane status. Regarding Molave, it looks to be quite a significant storm for the Philippines, and will probably be a typhoon landfall, from the looks of it. And Saudel, well, absolute disappointment at this point.
I guess you could put it that way. Let's take a look at Epsilon's cone real quick. We're going to get through this, and we have a couple other things to talk about. Epsilon's going to be moving out to sea here pretty quickly. It's going to be accelerating rapidly as it undergoes its post-tropical and extratropical transition here. It should be that way within the next 24 hours or so. Our latest Epsilon cone, as of a few hours ago, does show, again, basically right in line with the National Hurricane Center, a extratropical storm borderline on extratropical kind of hurricane status, if you will. You can see there as the storm does move northward, heading towards Iceland generally. Track consensus is pretty good, with a loop occurring at around 72 to 96 hours, as this does do a Fujiwara with another low pressure system coming in from around Atlantic Canada.
Thomas.
I've never seen a system get so close to Iceland, to be honest.
Hey, Thomas, we just got some breaking news here from the ATCF. It is upgraded 28 to 30 knots, 35 miles per hour just now.
All right.
28L?
28L's up to 35 on ATCF. The intermediate advisory from NHC does have it at 30 miles per hour still, but that is interesting to see for sure, and it's something we'll definitely be keeping in mind. When it comes to the intensity guidance here for Epsilon, you can see it's a very slow weakening trend as the storm does move along up towards the United Kingdom. As we take a look at tidbits and the Atlantic as a whole, we can see here Epsilon being the most interesting feature on the GFS, rapidly deepening all the way down to 929 millibars as it heads towards the United Kingdom, and you can see it there swinging into the UK at around 945 millibars at its closest approach, and then it's going to probably produce some tropical storm force winds of sorts before striking Iceland and moving north, if this long-range run is to be believed. There are some runs that do show it heading into the UK as well. We'll be keeping an eye on that. We also have the Euro here, which does deepen it all the way down to 936, and then does take it north as well. But definitely something interesting. It does also show a deepening TD28 as well, which is definitely something interesting to consider as well. Alright, well, before we go tonight, I do just want to talk about the South Atlantic. We've had lots of questions about it, so let's talk about it. I mean, when you take a look at infrared, there's nothing blaringly obvious. It's not glaringly obvious there's a subtropical entity that could possibly be in here, but earlier today it appears that we did have a meteorological agency tracking what could possibly be a subtropical cyclone here.
Yeah, it looks like we could have something form within the next 36 hours here, and if you're looking for where that would be right now, it's going to be that kind of feature that you're actually circling right there, particularly the one to the north, much closer to land, that's really just emerging offshore. Global models are in pretty good agreement that this thing will develop quite quickly over the next 24 to 36 hours and likely become a storm that's around borderline tropical storm strength. But by the time we get to day 3.5 to 4, this thing could already be completely gone. Interestingly as well, though, if you're looking right now, this is going to be an area of disturbance that is going to be coming offshore in about 2.5 days, and that's further inland right now. The GFS model wants to immediately, around day 2.5 to 3, develop another tropical cyclone in the South Atlantic, just offshore Brazil, but further south towards 30 degrees south. And that's also in good agreement right now with a lot of the other global models. So we could see potentially, like we mentioned near the top of the hour, if the first system forms and hangs on long enough, 2 concurrent active systems in the South Atlantic for the first time in recorded history.
Yeah, that would be something, wouldn't it? Alright, well, now that we've talked about that, let's talk about the worldwide tropical weather outlook that we have. We issue these every evening here. You can see we do have 28L and Epsilon in the Atlantic. We also have a 40% area of disturbed weather there in the MDR. which we are thinking could develop towards the latter half of the forecast period. We again have that South Atlantic system, 30% chance of development given right now. Invest 99W at 60%, with Molave and Saudel out there in the Western Pacific as well. And yeah, I mean, overall, when it comes to the worldwide picture, things are beginning to heat up, folks, and it's definitely something to watch for sure. So before we do talk about our final things of the night that are less related to tropics and more related to some of our outlets and future plans, to the team, what's your overall final thoughts on the worldwide tropical weather scene right now?
Can
Happened on this day.
On this day's coming up.
I guess some final thoughts is we're seeing this secondary burst in activity a bit later in the year than typical. We usually see this in, the very early parts of October, but right now we're in the late part of October, the fourth week now, with 4 active tropical cyclones, and there is the potential for us to have 6+ concurrent active ones if everything forms the next 3 to 5 days. So very interesting to see a spike in activity at this time of year, particularly in the Atlantic with 28L, which was really not expected to do much even just yesterday morning. And very interesting, of course, to see the South Atlantic trying to spike up too.
Absolutely. All right. Anyone else from the team have some final thoughts?
I would like to share mine.
All right.
Looking at the Atlantic, it's starting to die down yet start up at the same time. It has 2 tropical cyclones out there right now, but Epsilon is dying off, so really we have to pay attention to 28L now, as it might become a hurricane threat, but likely not, and we'll just say a tropical storm, but still we have to pay attention to it. And then we also have to pay attention to the Western Pacific with our 2 tropical storms, Molave, the one likely to be more significant, and then in the southern hemisphere, more specifically the South Atlantic, of course, rumblings of 2 systems that might form, and we might have the first time that 2 systems are active in the South Atlantic at the same time.
All right, with that being said, let's move on here to, first of all, on this day, something that Ethan in particular, why don't you share with us some stuff about Typhoon Rita of 1978?
Well, where do I begin? Typhoon Rita, 1978. Likely one of the most intense storms ever recorded, believe it or not. Recon on October 25th went into the storm and found a pressure of 878 millibars. And that was even after a day that they found a rapidly intensifying storm 24 hours earlier with a pressure of 888 millibars. Excuse me. So there's a likely chance that it's probably even lower than 878 millibars. And it's something that I just want to note real quick. Satellite imagery on the 22nd, when officially it was a Category 3 typhoon, it had a pinhole eye, and it was probably as small as Wilma's eye, believe it or not. So it could have been a lot stronger than 878 millibars, but we just don't know because Recon didn't get into the storm quite at its peak intensity.
Wow. All right, well, that is it for tropical-related stuff. I do want to say that as the stream does end, you can check out our Cyclone Tracker here on the Force 13 website. That's a very nice tool. You can see the current intensity of these storms according to the automated ATC app. This updates every 15 minutes, so you can get the very latest information on what's been going on around the wide world of tropics. You can also check out our Force 13 UK and Ireland Twitter. This is where you're going to be seeing updates on Epsilon if it does manage to manifest into a significant threat for the United Kingdom. And finally, we do have a 24/7 live stream that's going on all the time with the latest tropical information. So after this stream ends, you can tune in over there to our automated streaming service. Alright, with that being said, thank you so much for watching this live stream. We do hope you did enjoy it. We're going to be heading off now. It's been a fun hour, and again, thank you all so much for watching. To the team, any last words?
Can
Stay
Epsilon
safe.
please die?
Can
Yeah.
28 L
Under
please
there.
not become big?
I
All
want
right,
to add
here's-
that. I also want to add, just want to let everyone know that if you are in the path of any of these systems, regardless of how strong they are, to please heed all warnings and please do not underestimate the threats that they pose. It doesn't matter if it's a category, if it's going to become a hurricane, if 28L could become a hurricane, or if we could see a major typhoon out of Molave. Just make it the threat's still going to be the same. It's still going to be a significant threat to land. So please stay safe and heed the advice of local officials.
Yeah,
Alright.
please stay safe, everyone.
Alright, stay safe out
Stay
there.
safe.
Alright, we're gonna
Alright,
call it. Alright, we're gonna call it a night here at the St. Louis HQ. Again, thanks to all of you for watching. We'll see you next time.
Force 13 has launched a merch store where you can support our project even more by showing our colours, just like this shirt I'm wearing. Or if the weather gets a bit colder, maybe this hoodie as well, of course. And of course, they go in all kinds of different varying colours. Or even pillows. I love a good pillow fight. Or even these amazing hurricane-themed phone cases. Or how about a drink out of this Force 13 mug? So you can find the wonders of Force 13's merch store online at store.force13.com. Ah! Oh! Who did that? Making its infamous landfall, Hurricane Michael is still a Category 3 as it enters the state of Georgia.